Hi everybody. Welcome to the First Language Acquisition PowerPoint. We're going to go over first language acquisition pretty briefly, but I want you to have a basic understanding of first language acquisition as we'll get into second language acquisition next week. And as we're going through the PowerPoint, please be thinking about these questions. What is language? Do you think it's innate or must it be learned? In what ways do first language acquisition and second language acquisition compare and contrast? And is there anything that a person can learn without using language? Let's find out some things about first language acquisition. Look at the first bullet. First language acquisition occurs more rapidly than other kinds of developmental learning. If you think about that and think about babies, they learn language before they can use many of their fine motor skills, for example, cutting, writing, but it still takes many years to become fluent. On bullet number 2, infants exposed to sign language go through the same stages as babies who are exposed to oral language. Isn't that interesting? In bullet number 3, children first use content to learn language, then language to learn content. Children learn by unconsciously generating rules. And they learn language when they're in meaningful, supportive, and communicative settings. And many children have developed a vocabulary of over 14,000 words before they ever receive any formal language instruction. So that's very interesting. And then the last bullet, some people believe that you need to correct children's errors. But in fact, frequent correction does not produce error-free language, but instead it inhibits first language acquisition. And errors often indicate that learning is taking place. So as a lot of you are parents or grandparents or aunts, I know that you've probably done this with a young child. You'll hear them say something incorrectly, and instead of correcting them, you'll just rephrase it in the correct manner. So we have several theories about first language acquisition. We have the behavioralist perspective, the innate perspective, the interactionalist or developmental perspectives, and then connectionism. So those are all different theories of explaining how first language develop. So we'll look at each one of those briefly. The first one, the behavioralist, is based on B.F. Skinner. And I'm sure you're all familiar with B.F. Skinner and the stimulus and response. And so basically, behaviorists say that that's how children learn language, by uttering words or phrases, getting a positive reinforcement, and that's how language comes to be. But then the innatist came after that and said, well, wait a minute, that can't be right, because children are not just imitating what adults say, but they're making up their own sentences and using their own words. For example, a child might say, I eated 3 cookies before lunch. And an adult would never say that. They've never used the word eated. They've always said, I ate 3 cookies before lunch. So a child has generated that on their own. Noam Chomsky, for several decades, sought to refine a theory that would explain these and other surprises from research on first language acquisition. He sought a theory that would describe language as a set of rules that could be applied to generate all the sentences of a particular language. He called the theory generative grammar. Generative grammar is a set of rules for unlimited generation of language. There are deep structures, which is what we mean, and there are surface structures, which is how we say it, what we say and write. Chomsky's theory argues that children don't simply learn a language by imitating what adults say, which are the surface structures, but instead they use what they hear to figure out the deep structures or their language rules for the future generation of surface structures. Humans have things in language that are universal. For example, most if not all languages have adjectives. In English, these words are typically preceding nouns and are used to modify nouns, and in other languages they may be after the nouns, but nevertheless, that's something that is universal, adjectives. Early in the process of developing his theory, Chomsky thought that a specialized area of the brain must be devoted to this innate linguistic capacity, and he called this area language acquisition device, or LAD. Research by linguists across multiple languages has consistently found that children are not exposed to enough adult language to develop knowledge of deep structures, and adults do not consistently provide them with enough language production feedback to account for their rapidly developing capacities to limit language errors. Most children acquire language rapidly without formal language instruction, excessive language exposure, or extensive language feedback. Children progress to deep production with limited errors with or without surface input from adults. So the capacity must be innate. So there must be a universal grammar. Then the interactionalists came on the scene, and they agreed with Chomsky, but they needed more focus on the developmental process of language acquisition. And two names that you've heard before, Piaget and Vygotsky. And Piaget, of course, really focused on developmental stages. And Vygotsky was an interactionalist and really sought to understand and explain how people learn. And one of the most important ways that advancements in development are achieved is through what Vygotsky calls the zone of proximal development. Vygotsky described the zone of proximal development as the distance between the actual level of potential development as determined through problem solving under adult guidance or in collaboration with more capable peers. Teachers and other educators who wish to utilize the benefits of the zone of proximal development often employ one of the two strategies: scaffolding, which requires that an instructor shows by example how to solve a problem while controlling the learning environment so that students can take things step by step, expanding their base of knowledge without excessive frustration. And then reciprocal teaching is another strategy that can be used. And this is a highly successful teaching method. It provides an environment of open dialogue between the student and teacher, which goes beyond a simple question and answer session. By alternating turns leading discussions, students soon find themselves capable of assuming a leadership role. So those are very important things to think about in language acquisition. And then finally, we'll talk just briefly about connectionism. And basically, that's saying that first language acquisition is just like any learning, that we have to make connections between what we know and what we are planning on learning. And then those connections will go between words and concepts and phrases, and there's in our brain that we're making connections all the time. We don't know how to do things, we just know we can do them. We can't necessarily explain it. For example, a child can use language, but a child can't explain how she does it. We don't think about how words form and flow. We just speak. The rules are psychologically real, but experts continue to study how and where the process occurs in the brain. Recent studies suggest there is a complementary hemispheric specialization of language functions, but evidence still holds that the two hemispheres may differ in their language functions. As mentioned previously, children can somehow use language, but since first language acquisition occurs at such a young age, they can't explain how they are learning it. Developmental psychology follows the same train of thought. Even though researchers can see into the brain through MRIs, they can't see everything. We are making progress, but we're not there yet. And also, researchers can't ask very young children how they are learning the language. There are numerous studies that have shown that humans, regardless of ethnicity, socioeconomic status, language, have a natural predisposition towards first language development. So there's a lot that we still don't understand, but we are learning more and more. So we'll continue learning. We'll talk about first language acquisition and have a basic understanding of that, what we know, and how that affects our second language acquisition. So brain research is still ongoing. We are learning more and more, but we know we still have a lot more to learn about first language acquisition. There's an article as soon as you get done listening to the PowerPoint that's called Born to Speak that you might find interesting that I would like you to read, and that is on Moodle. Thank you so much for listening to our podcast on first language acquisition. Talk to you later.